The wheat was the first thing he noticed. Not the smoke rising from the valley below, not the distant percussion of alien war drums, not the creak of the dropship cooling behind him on the ridge. The wheat, a field of it, pale gold against the red caravan soil, swaying in a wind that smelled like iron and burning plastic. He crouched and ran his fingers through it. Not his wheat, not his world, but his hands knew the motion from 40 years of muscle memory, and for 3 seconds he was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere green, somewhere that still had his name carved in the gatepost. Then Sergeant Adeze Okonkwo called from the ridge, and Declan Muir stood up and went back to war. He was 44 years old, and he had been fighting the Veth for 11 of them. Not continuously. There had been weeks of leave, a desk assignment after Calix Station that he'd lasted 6 months before requesting redeployment, 2 surgeries, and a brief, disastrous attempt at a pension. But the war had a way of reclaiming its people. The Veth were patient in the way that only something truly alien could be patient. Not strategic, not cold-blooded, but patient the way plate tectonics were patient, the way a glacier was patient. They moved across human space at a pace that mocked urgency. They did not rush. They had no concept of rushing. They had never, in 11 years of contact, shown any sign of understanding that the things they were taking had once been alive, had once been loved, had once mattered to someone. This bothered Declan more than the killing, the indifference, the blankness at the center of it. "They're moving up the valley," Okonkwo said. She was 26, Kenyan-born, and she had the particular stillness of someone who had learned very young that panic was a luxury. She handed him the field scope without being asked. 3 columns. They're not hiding. They never hide. No. He looked through the scope. The Veth moved in their characteristic way. Not marching, exactly, more like flowing. Their bodies a pale gray blue that he had once heard described as the color of old bruises. Their 6 limbs articulating in that unhurried fluid motion that still turned his stomach after a decade. They were tall. Not grotesquely tall, not the movie monster tall that had dominated the early propaganda. Just tall enough that every human they stood next to looked slightly wrong, slightly diminished. Their command structures wore the bone-colored resonance harnesses that served as both communication device and rank insignia. He counted 7 harnesses in the lead column. 7. That was a fleet commander's compliment. This wasn't a raiding column. "They're here for the relay station," he said.
Sir.
That was Private Yusuf Tamboli, barely 19, still possessed of the unfortunate optimism of someone who had not yet been proven wrong enough times. "Command says the garrison at Mareth Vale is 2 hours out. If we can hold the ridge. We can't hold the ridge with 9 people against 3 columns. But the relay station. I know what's in the relay station, Private." He lowered the scope. The wheat swayed. A piece of something burning drifted down from the sky, trailing a thread of smoke. "Strength and honor," he said quietly, to no one in particular, and he was not certain himself whether it was an invocation or an irony, or simply the only words that came to him when he was standing on a ridge with 9 soldiers and a war he hadn't started and wasn't going to finish. He had said those words the first time standing in a field not so different from this one, at the edge of a different battle, when General Miriam Sato had clasped his shoulder and looked at him in that particular way she had. Like she was seeing something in him that he hadn't found yet himself, and told him that courage was a habit, like everything else. He had believed her. He still believed her. She was dead now, killed at the Battle of Ilion Approach 3 years ago, her ship taken apart by Veth resonance beams that didn't care about her reputation, or her record, or the 7 campaigns she had survived before the 8th one. That was the thing about the Vedeth. They didn't care. He turned to his 9 soldiers. "We're not holding the ridge," he said. "We're going into the valley." What happened in the valley was, later, described in 3 different official reports as a tactical improvisation, an unauthorized engagement, and a demonstration of commendable initiative, depending on which branch of the Colonial Defense Forces was writing it. What it actually was, what Declan knew it was, standing in the middle of it, was an act of stubbornness so pure it had become its own kind of strategy. They went down the slope in 2 fire teams, using the wheat as cover, moving at the specific pace that Declan had learned from an old Rhodesian tracker on his 2nd deployment. Not the hurried crouch run of soldiers under fire, but the steady, ground-eating walk of someone who has decided where they are going and intends to get there. The Veth did not expect this. In 11 years of war, humans had learned a great deal about Veth psychology, or what passed for psychology, their collective cognition, their resonance-based communication, their absolute tactical orthodoxy. They were brilliant in their way. They had conquered 4 other species before humanity. They were not accustomed to improvisation. The first fire team took out the lead column's resonance harnesses with shaped charges that Okonkwo had been carrying in her pack with the particular patience of someone who had been waiting for exactly the right moment. The explosion was compact, precise, and catastrophically disruptive to Veth communication. For approximately 45 seconds, the 3 columns could not coordinate. In Veth tactical terms, this was equivalent to cutting out a nervous system. They stopped flowing and stood, swaying slightly, their limbs making the small, uncertain articulations that Declan had learned to read as something very close to confusion. In that 45 seconds, Declan's 9 soldiers moved through the valley like they had been there before. He didn't remember most of it later, the way he never remembered most of combat later. It existed as a series of physical sensations rather than a narrative. The impact up his arm when he hit the ground rolling, Tambali pulling him upright without being asked. The specific sound of a Veth resonance claw striking the rock he had been standing on half a second before. He remembered Hagen, Corporal Eric Hagen, 300 pounds of Norwegian-American who had been in his unit for 6 years, and who laughed at almost everything. Taking a glancing strike across the shoulder that should have put him down, and instead seeing Hagen use the momentum to turn and drive his elbow into the harness joint of the Veth that had struck him. The harness cracked. The Veth made a sound that no human throat could reproduce. Hagen sat down heavily and said, conversationally, "That's going to hurt tomorrow. You're going to hurt today," Okonkwo told him. "Today's almost over." It was that kind of fight. Not heroic, not cinematic, grinding and close and smelling of overheated weapon housings and the strange sweetness that Veth biology produced under stress. Declan killed 4 of them and wounded 2 more, and at no point felt anything except the particular clarity that combat produced in him, a stillness at the center of motion that he had stopped trying to explain to people who hadn't experienced it. You didn't become brave in a fight. You became simple. Everything unnecessary fell away, and what was left was just a man in a moment and the decision about which way to move. When it was over, when the 3 columns had broken, and the surviving Veth were flowing back the way they had come, disorganized, communicating in fragments, without their 7 commanders. Declan sat down in the wheat and looked at his hands for a long time. They were shaking. They always shook afterward. He had never told anyone this. The relay station behind them was intact. The garrison from Mareth Vale arrived 90 minutes later to find 9 soldiers sitting in a wheat field, eating cold rations, and a valley floor scattered with Veth dead. The garrison commander, a young captain whose name Declan never caught, walked through the aftermath with an expression of barely contained disbelief and finally said, to no one in particular, they were supposed to take the station. They didn't, Declan said. The encounter took 3 weeks. This was, it should be noted, because anyone thought he had done something wrong. It was because 3 separate flag officers wanted to be the one to claim credit for the tactical decision that had saved the Korova relay station, and sorting out whose initiative it had technically been required the kind of bureaucratic archaeology that the colonial defense forces had perfected over centuries of institutional self-protection. Declan sat through 7 interviews and gave the same account each time. 9 soldiers, 3 columns, 45 seconds. The relay station was there when they arrived and there when they left. He had no further analysis to offer. What he did not say in any of the 7 interviews was that he had recognized something in the Veth command structure that afternoon that he had been trying to articulate for 11 years. The Veth were invincible as long as they were certain. This was not a new observation. The tactical literature was full of analyses of Veth coordination, Veth strategic patience, Veth resonance-based collective cognition. Everyone knew that disrupting their communication disrupted their effectiveness. What Declan had understood, standing on that ridge looking through the field scope, what he had felt, in the particular nonverbal way that he processed things that hadn't quite become thoughts yet, was something slightly different. The Veth did not merely rely on their communication. They relied on their certainty. They moved with absolute confidence because they had never encountered a situation they could not categorize. 4 species had fallen to them, and all 4 had responded to Veth invasion the same way: defense, retreat, collapse. The Veth had built their entire tactical framework around the assumption that they were facing something with limits. They had not yet met something that wasn't sure it had limits. He tried to put this in writing, once, in a memo to the Northern Reaches Fleet Command. It came back with 3 separate comments attached, all of which said some version of interesting theoretical framework, please quantify. He filed it away and went back to the field. 2 months after Kurova, command transferred him to the Tarantine sector. This was officially a promotion. The Tarantine sector was where humanity kept its most embarrassing secret. A Veth commander. Not a prisoner, the Veth did not become prisoners in any conventional sense. Something closer to an observer, or a trophy, or a problem that no one knew how to solve. The entity had been captured 18 months earlier during the collapse of Iridian Gate, under circumstances that were still classified, and which Declan had neither clearance nor inclination to investigate. It was housed in a modified containment unit in the basement of the Tarantine Sector Command Complex, and it had been successfully communicated with exactly 3 times. Each communication consisting of a single resonance pattern exchange that human linguists had spent a year trying to decode, and ultimately concluded contained either a greeting, a threat, or a philosophical statement, possibly all 3. The Veth commander was very large, even by Veth standards, and it wore a harness that was clearly damaged but not destroyed. And when Declan was brought to see it for the first time, it looked at him with the lateral sensory clusters that served it as eyes and was silent for so long that the intelligence officer beside him began to fidget. Then it made a sound, not a resonance pattern, not a structured communication, something that the room's translation software flagged as anomalous and could not categorize. Something that Declan thought sounded almost like a question. What did it say? The intelligence officer asked. I don't know, said the linguist on duty. Declan looked at the Veth commander. The Veth commander looked at him with its lateral clusters, and something in the quality of that attention, the focus of it, the patience, made him think absurdly of the way General Sato used to look at him, like it was waiting to see what he was. It said, Declan said slowly, not sure where the words were coming from. Are you the one they've been fighting? The room was very quiet. That's a guess, the linguist said. Yes, Declan agreed. But he didn't think it was. He spent 6 weeks in the Tarantine sector, and in those 6 weeks he went to the containment unit every day. He did not do this for any official reason. There was no protocol for what he was doing, no sign-off from intelligence or command, just a request to the facility duty officer that was approved, partly because no one had the rank to say no to him, and partly because no one could think of a good reason to refuse. He brought nothing with him but a chair, and occasionally a cup of coffee, and he sat outside the containment barrier and looked at the Veth commander, and the Veth commander looked back. They did not communicate exactly. The translation software produced nothing useful, but Declan began to understand, in the patient non-verbal way that he had always processed things, that the Veth commander was doing what the Veth commander had apparently done since its capture, waiting. Not passively, not with resignation. The Veth didn't do resignation, didn't have the concept of it, but with the absolute geological patience of something that had never considered the possibility of not prevailing. It was waiting for the situation to resolve itself. It was waiting for the pattern to become legible. It was waiting, Declan suspected, in the way that a chess player waits after making a move that their opponent doesn't understand yet. On the 23rd day, he did something that the after-action report would describe as unauthorized, and the intelligence community would describe as reckless, and that Declan privately would describe as the only thing that made sense. He turned off the translation software, not the containment barrier. He wasn't suicidal, just the software. The automated buffer that processed and filtered and categorized. He sat in the silence of his own incomprehension and looked at the Veth commander. And the Veth commander looked at him, and then the Veth commander made the sound again. The one that the software couldn't categorize. The one that had sounded like a question. And this time, without the software between them, it sounded like something else. It sounded like recognition. He didn't understand the language. He understood something beneath the language. Something in the quality of attention, the cadence of it. The same thing you understood when you sat across a fire from someone who had fought the same war you had fought, even if you'd fought it on different sides. The recognition of a specific kind of experience, not respect, not in any human sense, but something that the same shape as respect seen from the outside. He leaned forward in his chair. My name, he said, knowing it would mean nothing, is Declan Muir. The Veth commander was silent for a long time. Then it made a sound that the translation software, when he turned it back on, categorized as untranslatable, but which contained, repeated 3 times, with slight variation, A resonance pattern that linguists would spend 6 months analyzing and ultimately conclude was either a name, a designation, or a formal declaration of something, possibly all three. Declan wrote it down phonetically as best he could. Vorath Sem. The attack on Tarentine came 4 months later. They had known it was coming, not the specifics, not the date, but the shape of it. Veth's strategic patience was not secrecy. They moved at their own pace and did not accelerate for human convenience. But they moved in comprehensible directions once you understood that their logic was geological rather than political. The Tarentine sector held the containment unit. The containment unit held Vorath Sem. The Veth did not leave their commanders in enemy hands. This was less a matter of sentiment. The Veth had nothing that clearly corresponded to sentiment, and more a matter of the same absolute structural certainty that governed everything they did. An enemy who held a Veth commander held leverage. Leverage was disorder. Disorder was to be resolved. The fleet that arrived in Tarentine space was the largest Veth deployment in 7 years. 36 warships, 9 command structures. Intelligence had been tracking it for 11 days, and had produced 4 different strategic assessments, of which 3 predicted a direct assault on the command complex, and 1 predicted a feint toward the manufacturing orbital and a subsequent ground insertion. Declan had read all 4 assessments, and then he had gone to the containment unit and looked at Vorath Sem for a long time, and then he had done something that would later generate its own separate inquiry. He had asked for a meeting, not with the Veth fleet. That request would not have been authorized, would not have made sense, would not have produced anything useful. He asked for a meeting with Admiral Constance Ferreira, the Northern Reaches fleet commander, who arrived in Tarentine space 8 hours before the Veth fleet, and who sat across a table from Declan Muir in the command complex briefing room, and looked at him with the expression of someone who had been told something impossible by a source they trusted. "You want to put him in the arena," she said. "I want to put us in the arena," Declan said. "Him and me, this is insane. Probably. He'll kill you." Declan looked at the tactical display. The Veth fleet was 17 hours out. "Maybe," he said. "But they'll see it, all of them. And if I fight him as a man, not a fleet, not a weapon, not a tactic, they'll have to categorize it. They'll have to put it in a structure. And there's no structure in their framework for what happens when a human wins." The room was quiet. "And if you don't win," Ferreira said, "then you're 17 hours into a different plan, and I'm not your problem anymore." She looked at him for a very long time. She was 63 years old, and had the eyes of someone who had stopped being surprised by anything, except occasionally the specific varieties of courage that people found when they had nothing left to protect, except the idea that they were not yet finished. "Strength and honor," she said very quietly. He hadn't known she knew that. He hadn't known she'd been tracking his career that long. "Yes," he said. They cleared the lower bay of the command complex because it was the largest enclosed space in the facility, and because Declan had asked that it look as much as possible like somewhere the outcome mattered. Not a laboratory, not a containment facility, but somewhere with weight to it. Somewhere that felt like a decision rather than an experiment. Someone had the presence of mind to rig the internal feeds to broadcast to every ship in the Tarentine sector, human and Veth alike. No one had authorized this. No one stopped it. Declan walked into the bay alone. He was wearing his field uniform, which was torn at the left shoulder from Karova, and which he had never gotten around to replacing. And he was carrying the short blade that had been his for 9 years, and which he would not have exchanged for anything more exotic or impressive. He was aware of the feeds. He did not look at them. He was aware of the Veth fleet holding position, 17 hours out, of Admiral Ferreira in the command center above, of the 800 people in the facility watching through interior windows. He was not aware of any of this in the way you were aware of important things. He was aware of it the way you were aware of weather. Vorath Sem came through the far door and filled the space it moved into. Up close without the containment barrier between them, it was larger than Declan had understood, not just tall, present, in the way that things with absolute certainty about their own existence were present. The damaged harness caught the light and threw it in broken angles. Its lateral clusters fixed on him immediately, and with a focus that he recognized, now as something beyond assessment. It was looking at him the way he had been looking at it for 6 weeks. It was trying to understand what kind of thing he was. Neither of them moved for a long time. The bay was very quiet. 300 people were not breathing. Then Vorath Sem made the sound that Declan had first heard 4 months ago, in the containment unit, before the translation software came back on. The sound that had the shape of recognition. He had thought, at the time, that it sounded like a question. He thought now that it was something else. Not a question, an acknowledgement. A formal statement, made in the presence of witnesses, that what was about to happen was real. He raised his blade. What followed was not what any of the witnesses would have been able to describe accurately, because it did not look like what they expected, and it did not move at the speed they expected, and it did not have the clean narrative shape that combat had in the telling of it afterward. Vorothsem was faster than a human. Its limbs had reached that Declan's didn't. It had 6 points of articulation against his 2, and its sensory clusters gave it information he simply wasn't getting. In every objective, measurable way, he was outmatched. He had been outmatched before. The first exchange lasted 12 seconds. Declan took a strike across his left forearm that split the skin and sent his arm numb to the elbow. He accepted it because accepting it let him get inside Vorothsem's reach, which was the only place his blade was worth anything, and he drove the point into the harness joint that held the left side resonance cluster, and the crack of it was audible in the silence of the bay. Vorothsem made a sound he had never heard it make before. Not pain exactly, disruption, the sound of a pattern interrupted. He backed off and let his arm start working again. The feed was broadcasting. He was aware of this without thinking about it, the way a man is aware of his heartbeat, not conscious, just present. 17 hours out, 36 Veth warships were receiving the signal. He did not know what they were doing with it. He did not know whether the framework existed, in Veth cognition, to process what they were watching. He only knew what he was doing and the why was not complicated. There are things you do because they are the only things left, and then you do them as well as you can. The second exchange lasted longer. He was bleeding from 3 places by the end of it, and Vorothsem had shed one of its resonance clusters entirely, and one of its secondary limbs was moving wrong. They stood apart from each other in the center of the bay, and both of them were still, and there was something in the quality of that stillness, the matched weight of it, the mutual acknowledgement, that was different from every other moment Declan had spent in 11 years of war. Not because he was winning, he was not winning, but because for the first time, fighting something that had never considered the possibility of losing, he could feel it considering. He was making the Veth uncertain, not afraid, not desperate, but uncertain in the particular way that a geological patience becomes uncertain when it encounters something it has not categorized. And the window for categorization has passed, and the situation is still unresolved. He moved forward. The third exchange was the last one. He took a strike to the ribs that he was fairly sure cracked at least 2 of them, and he used the impact to drive himself into contact range. And there, at a distance where Vorothsem's reach was irrelevant and his blade was everything, he did what he had done on the ridge at Kurova, and in the valley, and in every fight he had ever survived. He found the stillness at the center of it, and he moved from there. The blade went in at the harness junction below the primary resonance cluster. Not a killing blow, not quite, but deep enough, final enough. Vorothsem stopped moving. The bay was still. They were a foot apart from each other in the center of the bay, and Declan was bleeding steadily from his arm and his side. And Vorothsem's lateral clusters were fixed on him with an intensity that had changed quality, that had moved past assessment into something he didn't have a word for. Not defeat, not surrender. The Veth had no framework for those, something structural, something that was trying to become a category. The sound it made was quiet, deliberate. The translation software in the command center above produced a single word. Sufficient. The Veth fleet, 17 hours out, began to change course. Not in retreat. The Veth didn't retreat, any more than they surrendered or felt sentiment. They changed course in the way that a river changed course when it found a new gradient, inevitably, structurally, without drama. The tactical display in the command center lit up with 19 separate repositioning maneuvers. Admiral Ferreira watched them for 4 minutes before she said anything. What she said was, "I don't understand what just happened." "I think," said the intelligence officer beside her, "that he convinced them to reconsider their assumptions." She looked at the display for another long moment, using one man with a knife. "Yes, ma'am." He stayed in the med bay for 11 days, which he considered excessive for 2 cracked ribs and a forearm laceration, and spent 7 of those days arguing with the medical staff about the other 4. The inquiry into the unauthorized combat engagement took 6 weeks and produced a commendation, 2 disciplinary citations, and a promotion to general that Declan accepted with the particular wariness of a man Knows that titles are what institutions give you when they've run out of ways to contain you. Okonkwo visited on day 4. She brought bad coffee and did not comment on the arm or the ribs. She sat in the chair beside the bed and looked at him for a while. The Veth fleet changed course, she said. I heard. They're not gone. They repositioned to the outer margin of the sector. I know. Command thinks they're still evaluating. They are. She turned the coffee cup in her hands. Is that better or worse? Declan thought about Vorath Sem's lateral clusters fixed on him in the silence of the bay. The sound that the translation software had rendered as sufficient. The quality of attention that had moved from assessment to something else. Something structural. Something that was trying to find its category. He thought about the wheat field on Kurova, and the way his hands knew the motion of running through it. Even though it wasn't his wheat and wasn't his world, he thought about General Sato saying that courage was a habit. It's different, he said. That's not better or worse. It's just different. From what? From what it was before. He looked at the ceiling. Before they were certain. That's the worst thing you can fight. Something with no doubt in it. He paused. Now they're not certain. What are they? Curious, he said. And then after a moment, so are we. Okonkwo was quiet for a while. Outside the medbay window, the Tarantine sector turned in its slow revolution, the station lights making pale arcs against the dark. And somewhere out at the sector margin, 36 Veth warships held their position, and in whatever way the Veth held things, reconsidered. Tamboli knocked on the door on day 6 and put his head in with the expression of someone delivering news they've been debating whether to deliver. Sir, he said, there's a communication from the Veth fleet. Declan looked at him. It's addressed to you specifically. Linguists have been working on it for 12 hours, they think. Tamboli hesitated. They think it's an invitation. The room was quiet. To what? Okonkwo said. They're not sure. Something formal. Something that has the same resonance pattern structure as a declaration. Like, he searched for words. Like they're proposing something. Like a negotiation, but the word they're using for it translates closer to. He looked at his notes. Closer to, examination, like they want to look at us more closely. Declan was quiet for a long time, then he said, Tell Admiral Ferreira I'll need the translation team, and tell them to have my uniform ready, the torn one. Sir, Tamboli said. Shouldn't we? The torn one, Declan said. They've already seen it, no point pretending otherwise. Tamboli left. Okonkwo looked at Declan and said nothing for a moment. You're going to talk to them, she said finally. Someone has to. Could be anyone. Could be. He looked at the ceiling. The light was the particular flat white of medbay lighting everywhere, and it had the effect, as it always did, of making everything feel slightly unreal, slightly provisional, as though the decisions made in it hadn't quite taken on full weight yet. He was 44 years old and he had been fighting for 11 of them, and there was, somewhere in the agricultural district of New Cork Station, a farm that had his name on the deed and which he had visited exactly twice in 6 years. He had thought about it a lot, over the years, not with longing exactly, more with the awareness of it the way you were aware of something you intended to get back to. A direction, a destination that remained valid even when it receded. Strength and honor, he said again very quietly. What's that mean? Tamboli asked from the doorway. He hadn't left yet. He was 22 now. He'd been 19 at Kurova, and a lot had happened to his face in 3 years. It means, Declan said, that you try to deserve whatever comes next. He sat up and put his feet on the floor and tested the ribs carefully. They objected. He stood up anyway. The Veth were patient in the way that only something truly alien could be patient. But they were, for the first time in 11 years of war, waiting for a human being to show up. Not to be fought, not to be processed, not to be categorized and filed and overcome, but to be looked at, closely, by something that had decided a human being was worth looking at closely. He could work with that. He had worked with less. The corridor outside the medbay was busy with people moving in the purposeful, slightly elevated way of a facility that had just realized the war might be changing shape. Not ending, not yet, possibly not for years. But bending in a direction it had not bent before. Someone had hung a hand-lettered sign at the junction that said, in large letters, "Sufficient." There was a misspelling. It didn't matter. The point was legible. Declan walked through it and past it, toward the communication suite, toward the 36 Veth warships waiting at the sector margin, toward whatever came next. His arm ached and his ribs ached, and his hands at his sides were steady. He had learned 11 years ago that courage was a habit. He had learned 6 weeks ago in a containment unit with the translation software switched off that so was understanding. He had learned, in a bay below the command complex, that what the Veth had no framework for was not human strength. They'd encountered strength before, had overwhelmed it 4 times over, but human persistence. Not the persistence of numbers or strategy or technological advantage, but the persistence of something that keeps asking what you are, because it genuinely wants to know. He pushed open the door to the communication suite. Vorithsem's resonance pattern was already on the channel, waiting. Declan sat down. He looked at the waveform on the display, the alien structure of it, the patterns within patterns, and he thought absurdly of a wheat field swaying in a wind that smelled of iron, and of his hands moving through it with 40 years of muscle memory, knowing the motion even when the world around it was all wrong. Some things you kept doing because they were right. Some things you kept doing because stopping was the one option you had decided not to consider. He leaned forward. "My name," he said, "is Declan Muir, and I think we need to talk." Outside, in the deep and patient dark of the Tarantine sector, something vast and unhurried adjusted its attention. The waiting ended. The conversation began.